My name's Matt Herron. Acknowledge that. I'm a program officer actually, that's out of date. I'm in the Division of Environmental Biology now. I have also worked in the Division of Biological Infrastructure at the National Science Foundation. And I'm here to talk about basically funding opportunities, training opportunities, and research funding um, I've tried to select programs that I think are relevant to at least some vertebrate paleontologists. So I'll be talking about some sort of topical programs, and also I'll talk about a bunch of sort of career stage specific programs, things like the postdoc fellowships and the career program and stuff like that. Next slide, please. Sorry, David's advancing my slides because of some technical difficulties with me sharing my screen. So this is my slide to convince you that I'm part of the in-group. I'm actually not a vertebrate paleontologist. I am an evolutionary biologist by training, but my closest contact with actual paleontology is studying what we used to call Brontosaurus back in the 70s. And actually did do a little bit of fossil collecting, mostly around Steinhatchee, Florida, looking for shark's teeth in the Steinhatchee River. So I'm not much of a vertebrate paleontologist, but what I do know about is NSF funding programs, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Sorry, next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is sort of generally, how do you find NSF funding opportunities? How do you know what program to submit your research proposal to? And there's a couple of really good resources for that. One of which is nsf.gov. Next slide, please. Sorry, there's some animations on here that are going to make this a little complicated. So at nsf.gov, you can do a funding search. You can look for programs that are in line with your research interests. Next slide, please. And maybe just sort of tab through these animations. And yeah, okay. So the other really good resource, though, and this is what I usually recommend that people use, also at nsf.gov, is the award search function, because every award that NSF makes is a matter of public record, and every award that NSF makes and has made is online as a publicly available abstract. So if you use this award search function, it's at the bottom of the Explore Funding menu there. Maybe if you click one more time, it'll highlight it. I'm not sure. Yes, there we go. And there's a basic and an advanced search function there. And the reason I recommend this is because you can plug in keywords for your research. So, the extinct genus that you work on, for example, if you work on one particular genus, or something more subject matter oriented about, maybe you study paleoecology or functional morphology or something like that. Type that in, search it, and what you're going to find is recent awards that include those keywords. And that's a really good indication. If you read the abstract and it actually is similar to your research, that's a really good indication that the program that funded that research might also be interested in your research. And then the other resource I'm going to recommend when you're trying to figure out what program at NSF you should be submitting to is to talk to a program officer. So this is a big part of our job, talking to the PI community and specifically guiding you to the right program. You really can't go wrong here. So if you think that maybe your research is a fit to systematics and biodiversity sciences in the Division of Environmental Biology, and I'll talk more about what that is later, and you reach out to somebody in SBS and they say, that's not actually us, they're not going to get upset about it. What they're going to do is they're going to say, that's probably closer to this other program. Why don't you get in touch with so-and-so over there? And so it's fine if you contact the quote wrong person. We'll direct you to the right person. That's one thing that we're really good at. My other recommendation is type up a one-page summary of the project that you have in mind. because that really helps us program officers evaluate what the right program for you is. Okay, next slide, please. You might have to click through a couple animations here of stuff I've already talked about. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to talk about, so I'm in the biosciences directorate. This is what I know the most about. I know for a lot of you, the geosciences directorate is also relevant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But generally speaking, bio is organized into 4 divisions: environmental biology, integrative organismal systems, molecular and cellular biosciences, and biological infrastructure. Next slide, please. I'm going to kind of fly through this stuff because I really want to have time at the end for questions. This is just to sort of give you a broad overview of the sort of scales that these different divisions fund. So generally speaking, if you're looking at little things, that's MCB. If you're looking at organismal scale things, that's IOS. If you're looking at population scale things and up, that's DEB. Although I don't want to give the impression that there's any firm lines between these. DEB certainly, funds things that look at molecular evolution, for example, and MCB surely funds things that are at the population scale. It's really a question of focus. Next slide, please. Okay, so biological infrastructure. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this. I'm really just going to focus on a couple of things that I think are likely to be particularly likely to vertebrate paleontologists. But generally speaking, there's 3 core programs. There are human resources, research resources, and what we call centers, facilities, and additional research infrastructure, or SAFARI, because we love our acronyms. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can skip that one. So I'm really going to focus on the research resources here. Innovation has 3 different programmatic areas: bioinformatics, instrumentation, and research methods. And it's pretty much what it says there: to design novel or greatly improved research tools and methods that advance contemporary biology. So that research methods in particular really could be relevant to some vertebrate paleontologists. Some of the stuff that I saw at the meeting, at the in-person meeting, certainly was developing new methods. The key here is it needs to be methods that are going to be useful to a community of researchers, not just to a small number of like you and your colleagues. All right, next slide, please. So the capacity program, I've actually worked in this program, and this includes cyber infrastructure, biological collections, and field stations and marine labs. Now, out of those, biological collections is probably the one that's most relevant to vertebrate paleontologists, because I know that you make use of a lot of natural history collections. So the collections programmatic area funds improvements to existing collections. We don't fund new collections, and we don't fund collecting activities, but we do fund, like I said, improvements to existing collections. So if you're in charge of a collection and you're looking to improve it by expanding its capacity, we also do sort of rescues of orphan collections. And then we also fund living stocks collections and things like that are probably less relevant to vertebrate paleontologists, but you never know. I think that program, for example, has in the past funded the Duke Lemur Center, which I believe I saw credited in some talks at the in-person meeting. Next slide, please. Well, here's a little bit more information about collections. It used to be called CSBR. I'm not going to try to remember what that stands for. Let's see. So yeah, like I said, enhancing, securing, and improving existing research collections. A lot of times these days that involves cabinetry or compactors, and we do pay for that kind of stuff under the right circumstances. Improving accessibility usually has to do with digitization, and we fund a lot of digitization stuff through that program. Also, that program is very concerned about sort of disappearing expertise in curation and collections management. So we like to see proposals that are training the next generation of curators and collections managers. And I already mentioned this transfer of ownership of collections. Usually that's rescuing collections where an institution has cut funding to the collection. All right, next slide, please. Field stations and marine labs, very similar to the collections program. This funds improvements to field stations and marine labs, specifically to their research capacity. So if you're in charge of a field station or marine lab, get in touch with Reed Beeman about this and inquire whether the improvements that you have in mind could be eligible for this program. Next slide, please. You can also always email me and I can put you in touch for any of these programs. You can email me and I can put you in touch, or you can just look them up on the web, and the web page should have a contact email address. All right, so the division that I work for, environmental biology, we tend to think of this as split into the ecology side of the house and the evolution side of the house. Certainly either one of those could be relevant to vertebrate paleontologists. I'm in the evolutionary processes cluster, and I know more about that than I do about the ecology side of the house. But I also wanted to highlight a couple of special tracks within the systematics and biodiversity science cluster. So if you advance to the next slide, I think that's on there. Yes. So advancing revisionary taxonomy and systematics is basically supporting the creation of monographs. It's a little bit broader than that, and you should read the description in the solicitation, but basically that's for monographs. And then another one I wanted to highlight was the poorly sampled and unknown taxa, because I think that could be relevant to some vertebrate paleontologists as well, to fill significant gaps in biodiversity knowledge and integrate taxonomic information within an evolutionary framework. Next slide, please. Integrative organismal systems has 4 core programs: and behavioral systems, developmental systems, neural systems, and physiological and structural systems. There's also the special program, the plant genome research program, probably not that relevant to vertebrate paleontologists, but a lot of that developmental systems that very well could be relevant to a lot of the stuff that I saw at the in-person meeting. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about these special programs just in the interest of time. MCB has 4 core programs: cellular dynamics and function, genetic mechanisms, molecular biophysics, and systems and synthetic biology. Next slide, please. I'm rushing through MCB because I don't think it's super relevant to most vertebrate paleontologists, though it could be in some cases. So now I'm getting into ground where I'm a little bit weaker because I've never worked for the Geosciences Directorate, but I did run these slides through a couple of program officers who are in the Geosciences Directorate to make sure I'm not saying anything really dumb. They also asked me to mention that there actually will be some Geo program officers. We use program officer and program director pretty much interchangeably, who will be hosting a town hall at the North American Paleontological Convention in June of next year. Next slide, please. So paleoclimate is one program in the Geosciences Directorate. Research on the natural evolution of Earth's climate with the goal of providing a baseline for present variability and future trends. This has no deadline. I should say that all of the programs that I've talked about so far, all of what we call the core programs in the Biosciences Directorate and the Geosciences Directorate, have no deadline, and they have no limit on the number of proposals that one person can be a PI or co-PI on. Okay, next slide, please. Some of our special programs do have deadlines, and the ones that I talk about, I'll talk about those deadlines. Okay, sedimentary geobiology and paleobiology, obviously a go-to for a lot of vertebrate paleontologists. So changing aspects of life, ecology, environments, and biogeography in geologic time based on fossil organisms and or sedimentological data. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you because I think you can read faster than I can read it out loud. But yeah, definitely get in touch with this. This is an email alias. If you email this address at the bottom of the slide here, it will go to all of the SGP program officers. And like I said, if you type up a one-pager of your research and send it to them, they can tell you whether SGP is a good fit for your research. Okay, next slide, please. And I think this is the last program I'm going to talk about. This is a cross-divisional program that does have a deadline. That deadline has already passed for this year, but you could apply next October 20th. Observational and modeling studies to provide paleo perspectives on past regional and seasonal climate and past climate forcing, sensitivity, and feedbacks. And this also has an email alias that will go to all the involved program officers. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned, I hope that's not going to auto advance on you. This might auto advance on you, and you might need to keep flipping back and forth. Yep, sorry about that. I thought I'd fixed it. Do you mind going back to the overview slide? This is going to be a pain. I'm really sorry. So this is just to show that NSF has support, and bio in particular has support for scientists at all different career stages, including K-12 teachers, and then undergrads, postbacks, grad students, postdocs, of course, the early career faculty with the career and BRC bio programs, and then mid to late career faculty with the mid-career advancement program. And we even have, it's not mentioned here, but the OPUS program, which is usually for late, I don't want to say late career, advanced career faculty. And we also have funding for professional societies, and that's generally funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion for scientific societies. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the REU program, Research Experiences for Undergraduates, has two mechanisms. There's REU sites, which fund cohorts of undergraduate students. And then there's REU supplements, which are usually just one or two students. These are supplements to NSF research awards. So you have to either have an NSF grant, or you can apply for an REU supplement when you submit your NSF grant. Next slide, please. So you do have to be enrolled in a 2 to 4 year college, and it is restricted to U.S. citizens. I think that's actually U.S. citizens, permanent residents, and basically U.S. citizens and green card holders. Let's see, it's a summer research internship, and it is a deadline program, so you should check online for the deadline for that. I don't know it off the top of my head. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so BioRETS, this is to involve K-12 teachers in your research, and it provides funding for that. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to read this out to you. It is a deadline program. That deadline is in the summer each year, so you might start thinking about applying for this next year. Again, this is restricted. The teachers involved, not the PIs, need to be U.S. citizens, nationals, or permanent residents. That's the language, and that's the language I was looking for on the previous slide. So really, this is intended to involve teachers in research so that they can learn new skills and learn more about biology and take that knowledge back to their K-12 classrooms to benefit future generations. Next slide, please. Okay, RAMP is a fairly new program for post-baccalaureates. This was really spun up during the pandemic when it was felt that a lot of students were missing out on the opportunity to have research experiences. So they created this program, but it's turned out to be very popular. So they've continued it even after the pandemic era restrictions. So it's really intended for postbacks who had very little or no research experience during their undergraduate. And like the REU sites, this is intended to create cohorts of postbacks to have research experiences. This is a deadline program. I don't have the deadline handy, but so you have to check out when that is. Check just, Google NSF ramp, and you should be able to find that pretty easily. Next slide, please. Okay, postdoctoral research fellowships in biology. So I actually worked in this program for a couple of years, and I met a couple of PRFB fellows at the in-person meeting. So I know that this program funds paleontological research. I should mention too that there is also a postdoc fellowship program in the Geosciences Directorate. I know very little about that, so you'll have to check that on your own. But that also funds paleo projects. You can't apply to both with the same project. So if you're trying to decide which one to apply to, again, I'm going to recommend that you type up a one-page summary of the project you have in mind and send it to both programs. Let them evaluate which one is the most appropriate for your research. But in the bio program, this is a pretty big program, something on the order of 80 or so fellowships per year. It's a 3-year fellowship. It is restricted to U.S. citizens, nationals, and permanent residents. There's 3 themes right now in this program. These may change in the future. But right now, there's the rules of life, plant genomics, and broadening participation. Now, I'm not going to talk about plant genomics because I don't think it's super relevant to most rigorous paleontologists. Rules of life certainly could be. Rules of life is pretty much what it sounds like. It's looking for broad principles that apply to biology. Usually that involves spanning scales of biology. Usually it involves integrating different subdisciplines of biology. You can find a full description of what the Rules of Life track is looking for in the PRFB solicitation. And I really strongly recommend that you read the whole thing before you submit to this. Broadening participation, you need to be proposing some kind of activity that's intended to broaden participation, specifically at the postdoctoral level. But it can be any kind of biological research that NSF funds. It could be anything from molecular all the way up to ecosystem scale, as long as it's not explicitly biomedical, because NSF doesn't fund explicitly biomedical research. This is obviously a deadline program. That deadline this year is, I believe, it's either mid or late November, so you still might have time if you haven't applied for this year. It's really, I'll let you look up the exact rules, but basically you should apply for this in your last year as a graduate student and or your first year as a postdoc. There's 2 different email addresses here because the plant genomics track is actually handled in the Division of Integrative Organismal Systems. So it's fairly separate from the Rules of Life and Broadening Participation track. Those are handled in the Division of Biological Infrastructure. So if you're thinking of applying to either one of those, email that bio-dbi-prfb@nsf.gov. Next slide, please. These probably should have done this one first. GRFP, the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. This is for undergraduate or undergraduate students who are going to be pursuing a master's or a PhD. Again, you have to be, for all these fellowship programs, you have to be a U.S. citizen, national, or permanent resident. Usually you're going to apply in your last year of undergraduate or your first year of grad school. With very few exceptions, you can't have finished a year of graduate school to apply for this. It's a 5-year fellowship that provides 3 years of financial support at any U.S. institution of higher education or nonprofit. Kind of already said that. There is one small carve out. If you've left academia for some period of time and come back, there may be an exception to that rule about not having finished a year of graduate school, but you should definitely contact the GRFP program and make sure that you fit that exception. Applications are in October of November each year. There's a ton of good information about this program at fastlane.nsf.gov/GRFP. including about your eligibility. The eligibility rules for this program can be complicated, which is why I really recommend, rather than ask me about your eligibility, check the website and talk to somebody from GRFP. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to talk about a couple of programs for early career faculty. So one of those is the Faculty Early Career Development or Career Program. This is for assistant professors or equivalent. It's designed, it's really has a strong focus on integrating education and research. So that's really an important factor in the evaluation of these proposals. And it's really important, if you want to have a successful career proposal, that you convince the reviewers that you're going to be effectively integrating research and education. This is a deadline program, and that deadline is in the summer. Next slide, please. All right, so BRC Bio, Building Research Capacity of New Faculty in Biology. This is a relatively new program, and it's for pretty new faculty at non-R1 institutions. You have to be within your first 3 years of a faculty appointment, and you have to be at a non-R1 institution. Now, a lot of those non-R1 institutions are MSIs, HBCUs, HSIs, and things like that. So, and all of those are eligible to apply for this program if you're a faculty member in your first 3 years. Not all MSIs and HSIs, though, are non-R1 institutions. For example, my alma mater, the University of Arizona, is an HSI, but it's also an R1. So you would not, if you're faculty at the University of Arizona, for example, you would not be eligible to apply for this program. Really, where the rubber meets the road here in terms of eligibility is I know I've said this like 4 times now, you have to be at a non-R1 institution. This has 2 proposal windows per year. One of those is already passed, but you could apply in the May to July 2024 window. As far as what the intention of this one, it should enable the establishment of a research program for new faculty with the intention that this is going to set you up to do some research early on in your faculty career and set you up to be able to apply for regular research proposals later in your career. Next slide, please. Okay, the mid-career advancement. This is for scientists and engineers at the associate professor rank or equivalent. You have to have been an associate professor or equivalent for at least 3 years. Now, there is one exception to the eligibility rules for the MCA, and this is new. This is a pilot track just in bio and geo that extends the eligibility to full professors, but only if they are at primarily undergraduate institutions. This is intended to give mid-career faculty a chance to enhance and advance their research program through synergistic and mutually beneficial partnerships. So to apply for this, you need to identify a partner. Excuse me, they don't need to be senior to you. That's a sort of persistent myth, but you need to establish some partnership. And the idea here is that you're going to be learning new tools, new skills, and new areas of knowledge that you can use to sort of retool your research program. This is a deadline. I guess it's a submission window rather than a deadline, from February 1st to March 1st annually. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not very familiar with these slides. Sorry. There are some new changes in the new solicitation for this. There has to be an impact statement that discusses the constraints on your time and resources to make sure that what you're proposing in the MCA isn't going to negatively impact your career. They've reduced the length of the project description from 15 pages to 12 pages, and both the applicant, the PI, I should say, and their partner both have to complete the collaborations and other affiliations form. That's basically a form that identifies conflicts of interest, so we don't ask people on those lists to review your proposal. Next slide, please. All right, BioLeaps, I mentioned this briefly before. This is funding to scientific societies, and it's really intended to facilitate cultural change to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in those scientific societies. There's 3 tracks here: the evaluation track, design track, and implementation track. This is a deadline program, so if you're representing SVP, you could think, or any other scientific organization, you could think about applying for this next summer. Yeah, next slide, please. Research in undergraduate institutions. If you are faculty at a primarily undergraduate institution, you should flag your proposal as an RUI. These are evaluated and funded out of the core programs, but that RUI designation lets the reviewers know that this research is coming from institutions that might not have the resources that an R1, for example, would have. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to talk, just because this is new, I'm going to talk about this, and because I think a lot of vertebrate paleontologists do field work. This is a new requirement. It's a pilot that is only relevant for some programs. So if your research involves field work and you're thinking of applying for any NSF funding opportunity, definitely check the newest solicitation to find out if a SAFE plan is required. Those include some of the programs that I've talked about here. So for example, all of the core programs in iOS, MCB, and DEB. So that means most research proposals that you would submit to the bio directorate are going to require a SAFE plan if you're proposing off-campus or off-site research. Also, some of the innovation program within the Division of Biological Infrastructure and the capacity program, so that includes the collections program, and then a few other programs. This list is changing all the time. So even if a program you're thinking of applying to is not on this list, check and make sure whether you need a SAFE plan. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so here's what's required for a SAFE plan. It needs to have a description of the field setting, any unique challenges for the team that they'll be facing in that setting, steps the proposing organization will take to nurture an inclusive off-campus or off-site working environment, communication processes within the off-site team and between the team and the organization, and then an organizational mechanism or mechanisms for reporting, responding to, and resolving any issues of harassment that might arise. Okay, next slide, please. Reviewers will be asked to evaluate these SAFE plans as part of the broader impacts review criterion. So they'll be asked, is there a compelling plan to establish, nurture, and maintain inclusive off-campus or off-site working environments? Whether or not the plan identifies and adequately addresses the unique challenges for the team and the specific off-campus or off-site settings, and whether the organizational mechanisms to be used for reporting, responding to, and resolving any issues are clearly outlined. Next slide, please. So there'll be a checkbox on the cover page. It's actually up to your institution to define what counts as off-site or off-campus research. And if you do apply to a program that requires this, it replaces the institution's plan that's required under the PAPG, the proposal, NSF's rulebook. So you don't need to submit both the SAFE and an institutional plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're getting into the end material here, which means I think that I should have plenty of time for questions, but I'm going to talk about a few ways to keep track of what's going on in NSF, keep track of new funding opportunities and things like that. One of those is that you can sign up at nsf.gov to get alerts when things happen at NSF. You have a lot of control over those alerts about how frequently you want them, about what topics you want them to cover and things like that, so that we're not spamming you with 100 emails a day. Next slide, please. And then all 4 divisions in bio, as well as the front office, what we call OAD, the Office of the Assistant Director, each of those organizations has a blog now that you can check out, that they post information about all kinds of things that could be relevant to you. Next slide, please. And really importantly, one of the things that you can find on the blogs is the schedule for the virtual office hours. So these are monthly webinars that talk about all kinds of different things. They talk about new and ongoing funding opportunities, topics of general interest to the PI community. And then this is a two-way thing. We take questions at the end of these things. In fact, usually we schedule them for an hour, and we try to keep our slideshows to a half hour so that we have a half hour for the Q&A. It's a different day and time for each division, but it's the same day and time for a given division each month, so that you can easily schedule these things. And we usually post the schedules and the topics about 6 months in advance. So one sort of pro tip here that I'm going to recommend is, don't just check the blog. For example, if you are a systematic biologist and you think that systematics and biodiversity science is, that's your jam, don't just check the DEB blog where systematics and biodiversity science is housed. Check all of them, because some of the topics that these virtual office hours cover are things like how to write a great proposal, how to write a great annual report if you have an NSF grant, how to write great broader impacts in your grant proposal. Sorry, I spaced on the term broader impacts there for a second. Also, just really great information about broadening participation programs. It could be all kinds of things. So take 5 minutes a month to check out the 4 divisional blogs, see what topics are coming up, and put those on your calendar. All right, next slide, please. Put the ones that are of interest to you on your calendar, I mean. And the very last thing I'm going to talk about is that NSF program officers are almost all members of the PI community. In fact, I don't know any who aren't or haven't been members of the PI community. We've all been, researchers who have applied for grants at once upon a time. And we rely on the PI community for all kinds of things, including to do our ad hoc reviews. A lot of programs send out proposals to topical specialists to review them. Also, our panels are made up of members of the PI community. And as I mentioned, program officers and even our division directors are members of the PI community. So if you're interested in serving at NSF in any of these capacities, email somebody within a program that's relevant to your, to the topics that you study. We're always looking for reviewers. We're always looking for panelists. We usually like panelists to have written a couple of ad hoc reviews, because that tells us that you're going to do a good job. But if you're interested in reviewing, and getting into that sort of pipeline, doing some ad hoc reviews so that you can be considered for panel service, it's not, I shouldn't say it's mandatory. It's not mandatory that you have done ad hoc reviews for panel service, but it's a really good idea. Then, like I said, email somebody in a program that you're interested in for reviewing for. And another pro tip here, one program that's always looking for 100+ reviewers every January and February is the postdoc fellowship program, because they have a lot of panels. So that's a really good way to get some reviewing experience. Reach out to the PRFB program and let them know that you're interested in reviewing. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned that program officers are members of the PI community, and about half of us are rotators who come to serve for just like 1 to 3 years. And the intention is that you'd continue your research program and eventually go back to your home institution. This is how I started off at NSF. It's how almost every program officer starts off. at NSF. It's a really great opportunity. It's a great job. I can't recommend highly enough that you check it out. Maybe talk to a program officer about their experience in serving as a program officer, and especially if you're, say, a tenured professor, consider doing this at some point in your career. Next slide, please. Okay, kind of already talked about this. What I didn't mention is if you do email somebody in a program that's relevant to your research, give a brief introduction of what you study. That really helps us to figure out, what proposals we might send you to review. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the end. I wanted to put up my email address one more time. Feel free to email me with any questions that we don't have time to cover during the Q&A, but at this point, I would be happy to take some questions. If I'm currently applying for a master's program, what would that be considered in the eyes of NSF, a recent graduate or another position? I assume this is a question about the GRFP, in which case a master's program counts as graduate school. So under most circumstances, you would not be eligible for the GRFP if you had completed a year of a master's degree. So this is the situation I fell into. If you do a master's degree before your PhD, like I did, and like a lot of people do, you can't apply for a GRFP for your PhD because you will already have obviously completed at least a year of graduate school.
And it looks like we have one from a Lindsay. I've always struggled with the award search option. Do you have any suggestions for how to streamline, especially when looking at past awardees for a program, i.e. or e.g. career, when I have looked them up in the past, a whole bunch of awards not relevant to my search shows up?
This is a little bit of, Google foo, right? You have to learn through trial and error how to work the system. The one thing I will say is that, I'll say a couple of things. One is that there is an advanced search function. Maybe you're already using that can set all kinds of limits, use multiple keywords and things like that, and or it may require career and another keyword. The other thing is that you can download those results into a spreadsheet and then do your own filtering for whatever, however you want to filter it. Beyond that, it's just a learning process, I think. Just like, learning to use any search engine to get results that are actually relevant to you. It's the same thing. But that advanced search function, if you play around with it, actually has a lot of really good options.
I used to buy one.
We have one. Oh, you go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading this one in the chat. For something like
Yeah.
the BioRets program, is that something that the institution would or could charge for, since it would be a grant-funded, teachers would participate for free? I don't know that answer for sure. I would be very surprised if that were allowed. I'm going to say, just to cover myself here, I'm going to say check the BioRets solicitation, but I really don't think the intention is for the institution to charge for involvement in that. I think the idea is that the BioRets award pays for that participation. All right, cool. But again, check the BioRets solicitation for an authoritative answer on that. Or if the information is not in there, reach out to somebody who is in the BioRets program.
We've got a few more minutes. If you've got a question, you've got a great opportunity here to get information about these opportunities and funding programs.
All right, well, I'll just say to close out, like I said before, feel free to email me, mherron@nsf.gov. It's pretty easy. don't worry too much if I might not be the right person to email you, because I can put you in touch with the right person. And also feel free to email me with any feedback about this outreach. We're really interested in sort of refining our outreach to be as useful for the PI community as we can. So if you have suggestions about, what things we might do in these outreach opportunities that would be useful to you, feel free to send me that as well. And if there's no questions popping up in the next 30 seconds or so, I'm going to go ahead and say let's close this out and thank everybody for coming.